Thank you, CDS. So now we can move to our second pleasant duty of this evening, which is the unveiling of a statue. This is its first appearance in the United Kingdom. It is going to stay at RUSI for a couple of months. It will go to the United States and be presented at the Pentagon, and we'll say a little bit more about that in a moment. But, of course, the statue is of Winston Churchill. Pitch, led by Eleanor Cork. Thank you. Thank you. Fever Pitch, and they'll be offering us some carols later on. Right, let me ask Alan Spence, who started this process of the bust, to say a few words about it. Alan.
I think if Sir Winston was listening tonight in heaven, he would have felt that was wonderful, particularly sounding forth the trumpet that'll never call retreat. I think he's probably tapping his fingers to that one. Chief of the Defence Staff, distinguished guests, may I firstly say what a great privilege and honour it is to have with us tonight members of Sir Winston Churchill's family, Randolph and Marina Churchill, Sir Winston's great-grandchildren. May we welcome them. Unfortunately, their great-aunt, Lady Soames, Sir Winston's daughter, unfortunately can't be with us tonight, but we do send her our very best wishes. And, of course, it was Lady Soames who accompanied Sir Winston on many epic journeys and visits, some of which made an indelible mark on the course of the Second World War, the history of this country, and the special relationship between the United Kingdom and the United States. For we here tonight are to witness the unveiling of a remarkable bust of Sir Winston, which next spring will be presented by the British government to the government of the United States by the Secretary of State for Defence, Philip Hammond, to the US Secretary of State for Defence, Chuck Hagel. This will stand forever in the Pentagon as a permanent reminder of the deep and enduring ties of friendship between our two great nations in war and in peace. To begin with, though, it would be severely remiss of me not to pay tribute to the sculptor Vivian Malloch, who, with the support of her husband, Ross, has laboured long and hard to achieve, as you will see in a few moments, a truly magnificent sculpture of Sir Winston Churchill. Vivian, may we salute you for your relentless commitment to this very special work of art, befitting one of the greatest Britons that has ever lived. Ladies and gentlemen. But how did this initiative come about? Michael mentioned myself, but it wasn't quite like that. It was probably actually a Royal Air Force conspiracy which started on Massachusetts Avenue in Washington, D.C. There, some 4 years ago, I met Air Vice Marshal Michael Harwood, who I believe is here this evening somewhere. And there he is, over there. Yeah. He was then Defence Attaché at the British Embassy. He took me to one side and he said that there was a move afoot to commission and present a bust of Churchill to the United States. In fact, it was largely his move and definitely his foot. In the great spirit of British public sector outsourcing, or is it insourcing, my company, Newsdesk Media, chaired by Lord David Evans, who is here this evening, agreed to lead, and how shall we describe it, a coalition of the willing to help this come about. It's supported, of course, by RUSI, and significantly because it was here, indeed, in the wilderness years in the 1930s, where he would work here in the library and where he spent much time. Also, and most appropriately, it enjoys the support of two organizations to which I'm very proud to be a member, the Atlantic Council in Washington and the Atlantic Council of the United Kingdom and Commonwealth, whose role it is to help foster relations between the United Kingdom and the United States. Meanwhile, now back in Washington, with Michael retired, the charge to complete this initiative is being led by General Buster Howes and his staff with equal enthusiasm and relentlessness. And the presentation, as I say, will take place towards the spring. To me, and I hope to others, this sculpture speaks mightily of Churchill's great powers of determination, strength of purpose, and great human presence, all of which fueled his spirit of total defiance in the face of what many viewed as inevitable defeat in the summer of 1940. As Hitler's Panzer columns swept towards the beaches at Dunkirk, and weeks later the Royal Air Force fought the Battle of Britain against all odds and against the momentum of conflict, he came to personify the defiance and the courage and the self-belief which shaped a year in our national history, 1940. In many ways, a year for all years, a year in which freedom was not to die. And it was, of course, not to die, because Britain and the United States came together with their allies at the fulcrum of an epic struggle which ultimately guaranteed the future of freedom. Forged in the dark days of the Second World War, the special relationship has stood firm through more than 70 years of peace and conflict. Through the long debilitating years of the Cold War, many conflicts which have scarred our globe, and today's war against other foes, terrorists, cyber aggressors, and others who threaten and challenge our each and every day and the way we choose to live our lives as free citizens. And so tonight, this sculpture begins its Atlantic journey to the exalted halls of the Pentagon, Just as the great man himself once set out on the battle-scarred Prince of Wales in 1941 to meet President Roosevelt to create one of the greatest alliances and friendships in history, ensuring then and now that our two countries work tirelessly together for common cause, freedom and democracy. And may all those who reflect on this magnificent sculpture in the years ahead dwell not only on the greatness of the man, but the greatness of the friendship he created. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Just on behalf of RUSI, I'd just like to say how delighted we are that this is starting its public appearances here. Alan mentioned 1941. For something else I was doing, I was looking at what happened when Churchill heard the news of Pearl Harbor. It was 72 years ago this month, 7th of December, 1941. And he was at Chequers. He was actually with Harriman at Chequers. And the news came in late afternoon. And as the news came in, and as it was clear after the first hour that this was pretty serious, that it wasn't just an attack, it was a big attack, and Churchill suddenly ran around worrying about how could he declare war quickly on Japan. Parliament wasn't due to meet until the Tuesday. This was the Sunday night. He had to declare war on the Monday. He'd always said, if the Japanese attack America, we will declare war within hours. And so he spent a lot of time doing that. Harriman was worrying about what was happening here at the embassy. And Churchill says in his memoirs, in his account of the Second World War, he said, I did this with a great sense of joy, because he knew that evening, he said, we've won the war. And he says that in his memoirs. It's what he said at the time. Lord Moran, his doctor, said he'd never seen Churchill so ebullient. He said, that's it, we've won. All the sacrifices that Alan talked about of 1940 had been worth it, because we'd won. And he said in his memoirs, he's got a wonderful passage about it. He said he didn't know what would happen, how difficult it would be, all the suffering that would take place. But then he gets into his Shakespearean mode, and he said, but I knew then, he said, that England would live, Britain would live, the Commonwealth of Nations and the Empire would live. And this island, he always talked about our island story, he says our island would not be defeated, and our island's history would not come to an end. And then he finishes the passage by saying, I went to bed and I slept the peace of the saved and the thankful. Typical Churchill. And of course, 70 years ago, we celebrate this month the Tehran Conference, the beginning of the Grand Alliance. This British-American relationship then becomes a Grand Alliance at the meeting in Tehran in December 1943. And with that Grand Alliance, this most impressive alliance the world has ever seen, then they committed themselves. They didn't say very much in Tehran, actually. The communique was a bit thin in many ways, but they committed themselves to a second front. They committed themselves to see it through. And that was fundamental. Of course, the alliance didn't last forever. It broke up at the end of the war, but the core of the alliance, the guts of it, that relationship between Churchill and Roosevelt, between two societies that saw the world in a similar way, was fundamental. And when we think about Churchill going to bed feeling saved and thankful, he could only feel saved and thankful because of a remarkable strategic decision that Roosevelt made, which we take for granted. Because we know what happened, we take it for granted. But think about it. Roosevelt faced a situation where America was attacked in the Pacific theater, and it sent most of its forces to the Atlantic theater in response. That was a huge strategic judgment. And if we think about it, if he'd not made that judgment, if a present-day president would find it quite hard to make that judgment, given how different politics now are, how different would our world, would my world be, if that judgment hadn't been made? And whenever I think about the British-American relationship, whenever, as allies, we feel a bit annoyed with each other, we fall into rows, I think about something that happened long before I was born, thankfully, in December 1941, a judgment that was made by the American president to put the Churchill view of the world, the British view of the strategic importance of what was at stake in this fight first, instead of the actual interests of doing something about that blatant attack that had taken place on the United States. And if nothing else matters in the relationship, then that matters. And of course, Churchill himself not only stood for grand strategy, he stood for individualism. He stood for the bloody-minded right of the individual to be an individual, and the right of individual people to find their own hard-won route to happiness. And for that reason alone, I'm privileged to be part of this ceremony this evening. And so without further ado, I'll ask the CDS and Brigadier John Quintas from the American Embassy to say a few words and unveil the statue. CDS.
I'm not going to embark on another speech, and I can't really follow what Michael has just said. I just wanted to say a few words of appreciation for this initiative. First to Alan Spence, thank you for those words, and thank you for your generosity in sponsoring this. To Vivi, who I know it's going to be absolutely splendid what's behind there. She's been, I couldn't call her a servant of defence, but some of the things that she has produced in commemoration of military things have been truly breathtaking, and I'm confident that when we pull the Union flag away, it will be a brilliant bust. To make the point, this is a gift which represents the relationship between the military families of the United Kingdom and the United States, which is why I'm delighted to entrust it in a couple of moments to John. There's a plaque that's just beneath it. You might not all get to see it, but the plan is that when it gets to the Pentagon, that plaque will be screwed above it. Might be below it or above it. Back goes. It recalls the words of Churchill's speech on the 26th of December 1941, and I think it's the words, I'll just briefly say them, which captures the sentiment and the symbolism of this gift. I avow my hope and faith, sure and inviolate, that in the days to come, the British and American peoples will, for their own safety and for the good of all, walk together in majesty, in justice, and in peace. John, please. We're allowed to do this?
Yes.
Good. Are you ready?
Ready.
Brilliant.
Excellent.
Absolutely brilliant. Isn't it? That is fantastic.
Brilliant. Well done, well done.
Beautiful. Beautiful.